Welcome back, folks. My name's Shane. I wanted to talk a little bit more about which solid state amplifiers I've come to really love over the years. Now, thank you everyone who watched my podcast about this particular topic. If there was any confusion about what I was trying to say, it was that a lot of the older amplifiers, solid state amps in particular, were built extremely well considering their price. So always like a budget alternative to a tube amp without a huge sacrifice in terms of tone. You know, the speakers that they were using back in the day were also very good and still in some amps today. If you look at like the Roland Jazz Chorus, for example, those things are bulletproof. They've been going strong for like 30 years. Some of the old Peavey Bandits, Tech 21 make awesome amplifiers. I used to have one of their Trademark 60 amps with the 2x12s and just absolutely killer amps. And I thought we'd talk a little bit more about solid state amplifiers and kind of like piggyback on the back of the conversation I had in the studio. So if you missed that podcast, I'll link it down in the description. You can check it out after this video. But I want to talk a little bit about which amplifiers I would recommend in 2024. And I should also preface this by saying I haven't tested everything. I never claim to. While I have 3,000 videos on the channel, there's plenty of stuff I haven't tested. And when I was talking about digital modeling amplifiers, I wasn't necessarily talking about the type of digital modeling amp that you put on a desk, like whether that's the Spark, the Nuix, or any of these other brands where you've got a small form factor amp plonked on a desk and you can practice. Those things are great. They're a completely different tool. I was talking mostly about amplifiers that you could take out, jam with friends, or even be heard on stage, because this is where a lot of those digital modeling amplifiers kind of fall apart, generally speaking, in the context of a mix. Now, there's definitely some exceptions to this. Of course, everyone's let me know about it in the comment section. But if you compare, say, a 20-watt tube amp up against even a 100-watt modeling amplifier in a room, you're going to hear a huge difference. The tube amp wins nearly every time. Nearly every time. Not every time, but nearly every time. And that's just my experience using both. So anyway, let's get into this. So one of the amplifiers I think that's gone completely under the radar, and it's an amp I owned, as I mentioned before, it's the Tech 21 Trademark series. These amplifiers are so good. You know, I really regret moving mine on years ago. I bought one. It was technically used, but never played. It was basically brand new from a shop. I bought it for $1,000. So that would have been about 600 bucks or so in the US. Now, for that price, that amplifier was so good, I could get almost any tone out of it. And if you're unfamiliar with Tech 21, they invented the whole Sans amp thing. They were the first kind of like pedal recording solutions that were used on famous albums. You know, they've got great tech when it comes to their analog modeling. It's different. It's not a digital interface like a lot of the things you've come to expect. They've got a whole range of pedals, including multi-effects pedals, and they're mostly analog too, which is fantastic. So not that analog's always better, but for simplicity's sake, usually when you're playing live, it is easier. And this kind of brings me to my point. The Tech 21 amp could get you anything from that sort of like Lenny style Stevie Ray Vaughan tone. So beautiful Fender cleans. It could go all the way through to classic rock and crunch tones, and it would get you all the way up to like a Carlos Santana lead tone, or even, you know, high gain sort of 80s hard rock. It had from basically everything in there. And they used pretty solid speakers in there, which contributed to the tone. Now, most of the speakers were Celestion 7080s that they used, but in that amp it worked. You know, a lot of people give Celestion 7080s a hard time, and I did, until I found 2 or 3 amps where that was the best speaker for the job. So if you can find a Tech 21 amplifier like a Trademark 60 with a single or 2x12, or even one of their smaller practice amplifiers on the used market, give it a go. I think you'll be very impressed with the tones, and they're one of those amps you can get a great sound at any volume as well. And they were one of the first amps I remember with an XLR output as well. So there's a lot to like about them. That's definitely one of my favorite solid state amps of all time. This next amplifier is one I used a whole bunch of times when I was last in San Francisco, and it's a great sounding amp. It's a great pedal platform, and no surprise, it's a Fender. What? Fender were making solid state amps? Absolutely. And they also made a Princeton. A good friend of mine, Alex, has one of these now, and it's a great little amp. And I used this with my Royal Flush pedal, and at the time I had a Wampler tape delay, and the tone of the setup was killer. I didn't miss having a tube amp whatsoever in the room. You get that great starting clean tone, and it gives you a really excellent sound. And rather than emulate a Princeton digitally, what happened to amplifiers like this? A solid state version of an amp. I would absolutely buy something like a Fender Deluxe Reverb if it was solid state without the digital CPU and processing. As long as it could be repaired, if the repairability is there, then I'd be in. I think that would be a great choice. It would be less expensive, hopefully lighter, and still feature a really great speaker, which kind of ties back into the conversation here. So this Princeton had a killer speaker, which gives you the majority of the tone. It was not long after this where speaker quality started to get worse and worse in solid state amps, and this led to them being labeled like a junk amplifier. So if you can find an old school Fender Princeton 112 and the solid state one, you can definitely see it's a solid state amp from the back. It's well worth giving this one a shot. And again, you can pick them up sometimes for next to nothing on the used market. Up next, we're going to talk about the Peavey Studio Pro 112, and these are kind of like the deluxe reverb of the range compared to the Peavey Bandit 112, which is kind of like the Hot Rod Deluxe. So the Studio Pro 112 is smaller, it's slightly lighter, the cab's a little bit smaller, and it doesn't give you quite the same sort of sound. And this is a great example of the speaker difference between these amps. If you take a look at the Peavey Studio Pro 112 speaker versus the speaker the Peavey were putting in their Bandit, even from the same range. So we're talking about the Red Stripe Studio Pro versus the Bandit. The Bandit speaker is more efficient, it has a larger magnet, it gives you a better sound. Now, a good friend of mine's replaced the speaker in his Studio Pro to a much more efficient Eminence speaker, and it's made the world of difference to that amp. It's every bit as loud as anything else, and it's much louder than the amplifier was with the stock speaker. And the Peavey Bandit had a more efficient speaker, or has a more efficient speaker, so it's going to give you a better tone. And this is a great example of almost handicapping the smaller amplifier with a less efficient speaker. And I guess this also would encourage people to go for the more, louder, bigger amp if you're a live player, but just by doing a simple speaker swap, you've got yourself a brand new amplifier. And this was the overall message in my podcast, talking a little bit about how the speaker greatly affects the amplifier, because you can get a Studio Pro 112, plonk something like an Eminence Swamp Thing speaker in there, whatever the case may be, you can pick your speaker. It's going to give you a night and day difference in terms of output volume, sound, low end response, all that kind of stuff. So yeah, if a solid state amplifier has a good quality speaker, you're going to get a good quality sound. The Peavey Bandit on the drive channel at least does suffer from that problem of you do really need to turn up the master a little bit to get an optimum sound, but on the clean channel you can get a good sound at almost any volume. So yeah, if you're looking for a good amp that's an all-rounder, both clean and dirty, the Peavey Bandit's great. I still recommend them even in 2024. Just know the reliability of some of the newest edition versions, maybe in the last couple of years or so, they're not as reliable. A good friend of mine kind of burnt through about 3 of those. So yeah, you kind of got to pick and choose with those. If it's been around for 20 years or so, odds are it's still going to perform well moving forward. I mean, you're going to find gremlins in gear no matter what you buy, but yeah, those older amps in particular are a testament to just how well they were actually made. Up next, we're talking about an amp that I've got a bit of a love-hate relationship with, and I'll explain why throughout this, and then we'll talk about the smaller version, which I actually prefer. So the Roland Jazz Chorus amplifiers are absolute tanks. And I mean that in every sense of the word, right? They're built extremely well. They'll last you 20 years, and they're heavy as nobody's business. So yeah, at least the Jazz Chorus 120, I went to pick that up in the store to take it home to review it a while back, and I went, you know what, I'm gonna leave this here, it's too heavy. So it is what it is, it's a beast, but Albert King used that amp, right? So, there's a little street cred for solid state amplifiers. Now, if we're talking strictly about their smaller amplifiers, like the 40, man, those amps are great. You can get them loaded with 2 10-inch speakers. They're a lot more compact and portable. They're still built the same way. They're quite heavy considering their size, but they're a lot more manageable. And again, you get a clean channel that you can play at any volume and also slam the front end with your favorite pedals to get your tone. This is why I prefer to play with pedals a lot of the time than rely on an amplifier's drive tone. It's a lot easier to replicate your sound going into a clean channel over going into or just using an amp, because if you're in a situation where you're playing through someone else's amplifier, or if you're playing out on the road or whatever the case is for actual touring musos, you'll be forced sometimes to play through different gear. So pedals make that whole process a lot easier, but that's a conversation for another day. The cool thing about these amps is they're loud enough to fill a room. Again, they're a bit more focused sounding than some of the others on this list, meaning they're slightly more boxy in their sound, but they have all the right stuff there. I remember when I reviewed Roland Jazz Chorus 40, for example, on the channel, a lot of people either loved or hated the drive channel. I thought it was okay, but I didn't think it was great. Again, this is another great amplifier you can pick up cheap, used, or whatever. And if you choose to buy them new, there's nothing wrong with doing that either. They're going to last you a hell of a long time. These amps have just survived long term, and it's great to see Roland still putting out great quality amplifiers even in 2024. Now, before we wrap this video up, I just want to talk about the distinction between what I consider solid-state amplifiers and digital modeling amps. So a digital modeling amplifier is anything with a USB cable, or if you can update the firmware. That's the way I look at it. A lot of people will say it's an amp without a proper transformer. I also agree. I don't know any digital modeling amplifier that has a transformer. Maybe the Fender Cyber Pro had one. I'm not exactly sure, but I think that was a hybrid amplifier. That's a whole different thing again. But I'm just talking about what's available today and the difference. So if it's got a USB port, it's a digital modeling amp. Now, I did have about 3,000 people say, what about the Boss Katana? Now, it does have a solid state clean channel, but everything else about that is digital. There's no way that's an independently operated 8 or 10 channel amp or whatever it is now, right? So a lot of that is done digitally. It's got a lot of built-in digital effects. It's still a great amp for the price, so don't get me wrong there, but I would absolutely consider that a digital modeling amplifier, for good or bad. People love those things, and if you turn off all the effects, you can absolutely use that clean channel with pedals and use it like a traditional amp in that regard. But yeah, it's still a very different experience to say something like the Tech 21 amps or the Peavey Bandits or whatever the case may be, right? So I consider them kind of separate, but I think the Katana would be a little bit closer because of that solid state clean channel. At the end of the day, you've got to pick the right thing for you and for the job. If I'm just practicing and I want something small, I get a digital modeling desktop amplifier. If I'm recording, the Kemper makes that easier. Or I'll use my amps with something like the Captor X, which turns the speaker and microphone digital, right? There's plenty of great solutions out there, so don't get butthurt or upset if something I didn't put on the list wasn't on there or whatever. There's plenty of great stuff out there. I have no complaints with anything you choose to buy. I only have complaints seeing the quality of certain lines of products getting worse and worse over time, with of course the brands that I mentioned in that video as the exception to the rule, right? So yeah, take it for what it's worth. It's just a bit of a conversation point. The more I use digital modeling amps and the more I test them, the more I'm starting to enjoy the simplicity of a great solid state amplifier, and I've made it to the shop, so I'm going to drop this stuff off and stay tuned. I've got plenty of great videos coming up. Catch you soon. Woo! Took me 22 minutes to get here. I wonder how long this video will be. I'll cut out probably at least 10 minutes of it. Anyway, catch you soon.